We've had one question from Paula Williamson. I think she's had to leave early, so if she's not here, I can read it out. So she's referenced a paper in BMJ Open and said that this paper in 2019 found that no core outcome set existed for the topics of 57% of Cochrane reviews. Of course, reviewers should consider using core outcome sets in their review if one exists, but should a gap, no core outcome set, lead to an implication for research, that should always be considered by Cochrane reviewers.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is about Pico. I mean, yeah, this is about Pico, or at least one element of Pico, isn't it? And it shouldn't be at the end of the review that you remember core outcomes sets. Ideally, it comes into the development of the review question in the first place. And I you know, maybe there is a sort of a need for people to, as part of the sort of development, the protocol development process, that they look at the availability of core outcomes. I also think it's sort of, you know, the degree to which you need to use all of them or a subset of core outcomes may well depend on what's driving the research question in the first place. So yeah, I mean, you know, sort of anecdotally, in that set of 12 reviews that I looked at, I did see a reference to more than one or two core outcome sets. I think there's generally better awareness about core outcome sets today than there has been in, you know, for a few years. And I think if there are core outcome sets that are worth using, it's not an implication for research. It should come into the protocol, really. But it is an opportunity at the end of the review, the end of the process, to look back and see where the studies fell in relation to those core outcomes.
Yeah, but I think so. I think you say that if no core outcome set exists, it should be.
Implications. I agree. Yeah. That's Sorry, I misread the question. Yeah. I think that's entirely reasonable.
So something else we were once asked as well is, why can you make direct recommendations in this section, but you can't in implications for practice?
I think they're fundamentally different. They're fundamentally different things. An implication for practice is almost invariably based on a decision between clinician and a patient, and it's individualized, and that means it's taking account that people need to take account of evidence, but it's not the only thing that's going to determine the decision to use a treatment or not. And the reason why, so it's not so much, you know, why is it okay to make recommendations for research? It's definitely not okay to make recommendations for practice, because the evidence is one element of that decision. Values and preferences come in. I think with implications for research, you know, you're not, the values and preferences element that sort of should temper the implications for practice, or temper the need to go for recommendations for practice. They're not the same. They don't weigh, I think, in the decision to initiate research, or, you know, how research is designed necessarily. So ultimately, it's about the use of those sections and the implications that they have in the different uses they have outside of the review. I think in the research world, I think you can make stronger recommendations. In some respects, it's you know, if you see something that you think is problematic and you can see a fix, why would you not draw attention to that?
Thanks, Toby. We've had a comment as well to say that was very helpful and will make our implications so much more relevant.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I'd say, this didn't come from my head. Well, I did the presentation, obviously, but a lot of what we saw when we wrote the guidance, we were sort of reflecting on some of the things that people were doing. so that there is sort of awareness out there. I think the reporting chapter is a really good start, but if you think through those three things that I mentioned, I think you'll be emulating practices that other people are beginning to use, and I think it's good to see.
There's another question. Is the implications for research section also applicable to non-Cochrane reviews?
Not for me to say. It's there may be different uses. I don't know. It depends on, I think, what you're doing the review for. If you're thinking about non-Cochrane reviews, if you're doing the review because you want a publication, and you're not necessarily commissioned to do it by a body or a guideline group, it may be that you're not necessarily looking to future versions of that review. But if you're looking to update a review in the future, I actually think there's a potential for a feedback loop, which is kind of implicit with Cochrane reviews, because the expectation is that, or default expectation, I think, is that they'll be revisited in the future. So when I was thinking about this talk, I was thinking quite exclusively about Cochrane reviews, because the implications for research section should be a way to make sure that future versions of your review reach more definitive conclusions. If that's your goal, then I think there's no reason why you wouldn't take elements of what I've said today, or all of them, and implement them as you see fit. But it's very much a question of if you're doing a non-Cochrane review and you've looked at the guidance, there's no reason why it wouldn't necessarily apply. But it's up to you whether the future versions are worth sort of revisiting, and your loyalty to the question is very much something that you're going to have to wrestle with at some point.
Will information from trial sequential analysis be of value when writing up the implications for research?
I've no idea. I think if it's informed downgrading decisions, then maybe it's worth doing that. You may be able to do a power calculation, but honestly, Kerry, that's probably more your domain than mine.
Yeah. Yeah, like you said, I think if it impacts the results and it's worth feeding back on, then yeah, it's worth including in implications for research. Another question: should people use Brown AI? So that's referencing paper how to formulate research recommendations. It said it included Cochrane people that worked on in 2005 and 2006. So this is from Mike Clark. So it was I don't know whether you're aware of the paper. Toby Polly Brown, Julie Glanville. Obviously Mike Clark, and Ian Chalmers as well.
I'd be interested to know whether the things I've picked out were in that. Because grade didn't exist as far as I know in 2005, and I think awareness about ongoing studies I think wasn't, well, I don't think would have been as strong. But no, I haven't read it. But if it's similar, that's great. If it's different, I'd like to know a bit more.
Mike, I don't know whether you want to raise your hand and say anything, or feel free to, or don't worry if you don't want to. Someone else has asked as well if it's possible to have the presentation, and the recording will be made available on the Method Support Unit website after later today. But yeah, thanks for making us aware of that paper, Mike. We'll have a look at it and just compare.
Yeah.
Sometimes the main findings for review are limitations of the evidence, but they often get squeezed out of the abstract.
Yes.
I think it's quite difficult, isn't it, with the word limit?
Yeah, I mean, I come back to that. So those four pointers that I placed over those last two slides that I gave. Maybe if I just go back, I think where you think that a limitation is, so if it is one of the main findings, if it is one of the main things, I can't see how you can leave it out of the abstract. And I'd be happy to see, an abstract that faithfully reflected the most important take-home messages in a review, irrespective of what they were, irrespective of whether it was good news or bad news or something in between. And if there's a sort of an urgency issue or a quite specific limitation, whether there's a fix, or you think you've got a way that future research could address it, maybe there is a way to summarize it and put it in the conclusions section. I think Mike's raised his hand.
He has, so I'm gonna try this now. This is the first time I've done this. Mike, are you able to speak?
Yep.
Great.
I think so. Hi. Hi everyone. Thanks, Toby. Yes. So sorry if I lost your response about Brown because I had an internet hiccup.
Okay.
I think a key thing with it. So I heard a bit about grade and trial registries, and I think that they were sort of bit there at the beginning. But the key thing with Brown et al. And a few groups follow it. Schizophrenia follow it. Is to give the structure. Yeah. It's the thing that leads to what sometimes the table in the implications for research section, where they would say this is the P, this is the study design that would be needed, and it didn't get the take up. And it's to pick up on that, and also a question that somebody asked about non-Cochrane. It was also aimed at non-Cochrane reviews because it included people from NICE who were saying, how can systematic reviews, whether or not they are Cochrane, lead to the research that we need, because the majority of reviews are still having to conclude that the evidence is too weak. The evidence is either lacking or too weak. How can we fill the gap? So here's something we had in the handbook. The other thing, I'll put a couple of other URLs in the chat as well, because it's interesting, because the years old.
Yes.
Plus 15 years plus. And I'll put it in the chat, but
sure.
There's a paper called Clark, which we call Clark Cubed, which is from 2007, and we looked at 2,500 implications for research, and showed what things we're doing then. And it'd be great to have, how are we doing different now? But I'll put some URLs in chat. Thanks.
Nice. Yeah. No. Thanks, Mike. I think Pico survives as a key. One of the reasons why I think Pico is important. That's a framework. That's the question, and it sort of lives. It kind of lives through the review, and it's probably quite a nice way to link back, if you think about it, to link back to how you structured it in the protocol. And so you can see, I put the tram lines up for where the studies had accumulated, and something similar, I think, at the end of the review would be good. It's a nice structure. I think it's as you can see, it's not the only element that I think is sort of where you've got to think through, and it probably is useful for thinking through, quite specifically about populations, interventions, comparisons, and outcomes. But I think issues around how studies need to be conducted, and there was a nice example of a wounds review which I was going to put in, and then I sort of had a change of heart and put the infectious diseases one in. But there was a nice wounds review on compression bandaging, where in the implications for research section, they had actually sort of come up with recommendations for study investigators to avoid bias, and it kind of depends on I guess where does that additional detail live. If you think this is a way to try and overcome bias. Basically, when we did the risk of bias assessments, we saw performance bias, or we saw issues with attrition. What are the steps that people need to undertake to address that? And if that can live alongside the Pico structure that Mike's described, that's good. sometimes it's sort of it's kind of the most urgent thing, and that's why I think the sort of the prominence that you give, the attention you give to it, should reflect, you know, how big a limitation it is in the review, and how future studies can overcome it.
Thanks, Toby, and thanks, Mike, for those useful references as well. I'll find a way to make those available on the website with the recording as well of this web clinic. I think they'll be really useful for people to refer to. Are there any other comments or questions? Please raise your hands if you'd like to speak as well. Don't know whether any of the team want to add anything or.
I'm just going to add that I'm going to go back to a airways review that I'm finishing up and develop, put a bit more effort into my implications for research section.
I think it's one of the things that's true is that when you read across reviews, or you know, you're looking at particular elements of them, you start to learn about you don't just learn about common errors. It's quite a negative way to think about it. You actually, some of the most valuable learning is in good practices, or where you see something that's kind of, it's well structured, it's coherent, and there's a logical flow. It's like that transfusion thresholds review example I quoted. There was a nice kind of threading of information, or threading of a framework that you could see developing in the background section. It gets a bit more airtime in the eligibility criteria. It comes, you know, sort of describing studies in relation to that, and then that of interpretive element where you start thinking, actually, that's where the gap is, and then by the time the implications for research are sort of being formulated, it's inevitable. It doesn't write itself, but it's an obvious thing to go for. So I think it's stuff like that I think is worthwhile. When you sort of see things that are nicely done, well done, and you think, how would I incorporate that into something I've got, and makes you sort of look at the evidence you've got, look at the review you've got, maybe in a new light or in a slightly new way, and it does help you overcome a struggle with a bit of the review that, as we saw from that pie chart, probably one of the hardest things to write.
We've actually had a couple more questions come in as well. If you still got some energy left. May I suggest to the reader the investigation of a specific subgroup that generated inconsistency in a meta-analysis? I have a similar situation in one of my reviews.
What do we think about subgroups, Kerry?
Your favourite topic.
It's my favourite topic. If it's okay, so I'm always much more comfortable with subgroups being the basis of further studies. I am about implications for practice, and for lots and lots of reasons, which will be a subject, I'm sure, of another web clinic. But yeah, I mean, I think if it's sort of a subgroup that you set up, you think about where that sat in relation to the question. Was it pre-specified? Do you think you sort of arrived at something which it's uncertainty about whether there's a different effect in those two subgroups? Is that something that would you could sort of test in a way that would give you a clearer answer? Sometimes I think you've got to look at the limitations of that particular analysis to work out whether a new study to specifically underscore a subgroup analysis is worthwhile. If it's something that you can otherwise randomize, then between different interventions, for example, then it's probably not worth doing it. If it's something that's like a patient characteristic, severity of disease, I mean, the example that springs to mind recently for me is the corticosteroid COVID review, where they've actually subgrouped by requirement for oxygen at the point of initiation of therapy. And that might be a basis for further studies. But yeah, I'd think quite carefully about what you were asking for in relation to that subgroup before doing it. But in principle, you may, but it may not be a reasonable thing to commission or fund further research into. Sorry, that was heavily caveated.
And there's lots of thanks here as well. I'll review my abstract and include the limitation of the evidence. Someone asking about the recording. Yes, the recording will be made available on the Cochrane Method Support Unit website. If you go to our website, it will be there later today. And then we have one more question. Thank you for your presentation and insight. Do you think that the existence of evidence that comes from predatory journals should be highlighted in this section? So this is from Fabiana. I'm not sure if I'm clear on that. I can comment a bit more if necessary.
This is interesting, isn't it? I mean, I'm glad I've got this slide up, because I think some things are worth emphasizing over others. The urgency and the detail should be proportionate to the value filling the gap. I think it depends on what you're asking for with that. So if you're saying other researchers who are doing reviews in this area need to be mindful of this, I think that's okay. But you've got to be certain that what you're highlighting as a limitation is indeed the problem that you think it is. If we're talking about studies of dubious provenance, I think you've probably got to highlight that. But I think also be careful about what you're saying about particular journals or researchers. If those articles may well have come from an otherwise well conducted study. It's just that with some of those journals, it's not always easy to tell. But I think if you're sort of directing people to think really carefully about how they use that information, then I think that's entirely fair and reasonable.